Thanks, Andy. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, we'll go with that. Now, I don't have very good eyesight, and that's why I put all these chairs up front. If you've got really good eagle eyesight, sit in the back. But if you don't, come up. I don't bite. I don't have COVID. I'm fairly friendly. So just come on up so you can see the presentation. Now, you just talk to each other and ask what was going to you expected from this. Question for you. Are you in favor of offshore wind? Rate it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Keep it to yourself. I don't. But the reason I asked for that is we're going to go through a bunch of stuff and see how your opinion changes. I am not here to make you change your opinion. I only am asking people to be open to new information, get as much information as possible, get sourced, reliable information, and not get your source of information being the internet. I've heard it's not reliable. All right, what I wanted to do was to go through 5 different things that are basically who, what, where, when, why. And so the what is, what's on the table right now for Oregon is the installation of up to 3 gigawatts of floating wind. How many people does a gigawatt really mean anything? That's what I thought. 3 gigawatts would be 3,000 megawatts. And to get a sense of that, an average, say, a natural gas or coal-fired power plant would be about 500 megawatts. So basically, what we're talking about is maybe 6 power plants out in the ocean. So it gives you a sense of what they're talking about. Now, where did that come from? In 2020, the Pacific Northwest National Lab, PNNL, did a study. They looked at the value of the offshore wind on the grid. Now, they found that as compared to Northern California, our grid here could accommodate up to 3 gigawatts without major changes or major disruptions. Basically, for sure, too, because, I mean, the power's coming to me. I'm on the coast. It's coming across from the I-5 corridor. You can reverse it. That's a nice thing about electricity. And 2 for sure, 2.5, and then maybe a half a gigawatt on the coast. So that was where that number came from. Now, what would that mean? The standard for expected to be the turbine size would be about 15 megawatts. If you've seen them on shore, they're about 2. Offshore, they could be up to 15. 15 into 300 gigawatts, talking around 200 of these turbines that are going to would be out there if this goes through. But that's not the whole thing. The system includes the turbines, the wind farms, but their anchor systems. How do they stay out there? The offshore cables and substations. How do you get electricity onshore? Then onshore cables and substations and things like that. Onshore transmission lines, substation upgrades, and of course support facilities, which includes people. So there's an awful lot there. And if you just focus on what you've heard about BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, what they're doing offshore, that's a tiny part of it. It's a lot more complete than that. So you do need to be aware of the whole framework. They are big. They are huge. The Olympics are going on right now. They keep showing the Eiffel Tower. That's kind of the size of one of these. I was driving down to the Bay Area a couple of weeks ago, across the Golden Gate Bridge. As I was going up and going, one of those is taller than the tower of the Golden Gate Bridge, the towers. So yes, they are big. There are several different kinds that we typically look at. Spar is the kind, just sort of think of it as a telephone pole up straight with a bunch of weight at the bottom. It's enough to be floating upright. Now, it doesn't have a lot of area for the surface, for the waves to act on, which is a good thing. And because it's got a low wave area, it works well. But these cannot be, they can't be built out in the ocean, unlike the way that the bottom-mounted ones in the East Coast are. So they have to be assembled in a harbor, and it takes a very deep harbor for that. So that might limit whether they could be using spars out here. Another kind is a semi-submersible. You've seen pictures of these things. Now, these are good because they sort of spread out the area on basically a triangle. How big is that triangle? Think of the inside of a baseball stadium. That's about the size of the footprint of one of these things. Now, it's good because it spreads it out, but that also means it's more actions of the waves to move them around. So they are a bit of a problem, but they can be constructed in shallower harbors and such. For right now, there are two harbors that are really under consideration: Humboldt and Port of Long Beach. Now, third type is this tension leg platform. It's kind of like the semi-submersible, and that's why if you want to come up, it's okay. They're interesting. They basically are floating under the water. The floats are under the water, and they're held down really tightly. So they're not moving around a whole lot, and that gives their stability. However, as they're being moved around from where they're being built to where they're going to be anchored, they're a little bit tougher to work with. So there are benefits and drawbacks to each one. And what is going to be used will be based on the company that gets the lease, that gets through the whole process to decide what they want out there. All right, where? You've heard probably that there were two call areas. A call area is BOEM said, hey, give us an interest. Tell us what we were calling for information in order for interest. In order to know what BOEM is offering, they had to pick some spots out there. There were originally 3, got distilled down to Coos Bay and Brookings. And to get a sense of the one in Coos Bay, it was about the size of Coos County. So it was pretty big size. Brookings was smaller. That got distilled down to what was called wind energy areas, WEAs. And the WEAs, the one that is for Brookings, that is about half of that call area, roughly. That would be about 2,000 megawatts, 2 gigawatts, having something on the order of 18 miles offshore. It's going to be at a depth of 1,800 to 5,000 feet. That is very deep. It's way beyond what you could have about a mounted thing. So if you hear somebody said, well, onshore or near shore or far, everything is a long ways out. And by one measure, it could power about 750,000 homes. There are a lot of estimates on that. For Coos Bay, that got distilled down radically. And from that whole area, it's distilled down to about 96 square miles, about a little less than a gigawatt of power. So collectively, we're going to about the 3 gigawatt size. This is a little bit shallower, as deep as 4,600 feet. Everything's in meters if you read it, but these are the conversions. And 350,000 homes. Right, where are we in the process? I took this from a presentation that BOEM made about 2 years ago. And at the time, they were saying, we are here early on in planning and analysis. The reason I like this is that it shows that we are now to the mid to late 2024 is when we'd have a lease generated, a lease submitted, a leasing does these things. So we're at about this part, so we're kind of on track for what they were saying. Now that's getting to the point where they will go out for bids. The bidders will give the bids, they'll do an auction and go through all that. And the expectation is that there would be 2 successful bidders, one for Coos Bay and one for Brookings. Now that just starts things because the successful bidder then has to put together a sampling and analysis plan and has to be reviewed. And has to do a bunch of things before they then do the next big step, which is 3 to 5 years worth of site assessment. They have to go out and figure out where are the whales going to be? Where are the birds? What is the terrain like? What sort of engineering do we have to do? How is it for a spar buoy or a tension leg platform? If you were going to use that, how would you do that? There's a huge amount of engineering that's got to go in. And long about, say, late this decade, 2029, 2030, that's when they would put together a construction and operations plan, a COP. So you hear about the COP, that's what then triggers the next review. Now, people get a little concerned because they said, doing all this stuff and there's been no environmental review. That's a fluke of the way that NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, works. What a federal agency has to do, they have to look at what action they are taking and what are the consequences of that action. Issuing a lease only gives a company the right to go out and investigate it, put some buoys out, run some transects, look at what's there. They can't put anything significant in the water. And if they go out and find this is terrible, it's not going to go, then nothing will happen. So they do the investigation. They then give this cop to BOEM and says, this is what we're planning on doing and how we're going to do it, all the details. Now, instead of BOEM just giving a lease for people to investigate, they're saying, you can go build this stuff out there. Now, the potential for impacts are significant, substantial. That's when you get an EIS, an environmental impact statement. And that's going to take at least 2 years to be done. And so the evaluation, we're talking maybe out here 2031, 2033, that they would even be permitted to start putting anything out there. So it is not immediate. It is something that we have a lot of time to do a lot of investigation, ask a lot of questions, be involved in the negotiations. So it is critically important to be educated and to make sure that you have an appreciation for what all is there. What are the concerns we have to have? And what are ways that we can address those concerns? Who? There are kind of two parts to the who. One is the agencies. The agencies, offshore, we have the federal waters. That's something that is controlled by BOEM, again, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. They manage ocean energy, which includes oil and gas and various other things related to this. So they're the ones that have to say, yes, federal government, we should lease this area to this company or that company. Onshore, it's the state, 3 miles and in. And so what's going on out here, offshore, is not something the state has influence over for the most part. I caveat that because there is something that just happened where BOEM said, we're saying that the actions they have taken are consistent with the Coastal Zone Management Act as is carried out by the state. So the state said, what you're asking to do is consistent with our plans. And so that's something, but it seems pretty trivial, pretty little, but it's an important time. And it means that if what BOEM later decides to do is in conflict with the Oregon coastal management plans, then they can stop it. So there are a lot of ways you can have influence on this. That's the regulatory side. The other side is who are the leasers, the potential leasers. Right now, there are 4 companies, 4 groups that submitted qualifications. Kind of think of it, if you're going for a home loan, you go and give some information to the banks and they say, all right, you're pre-qualified. Doesn't mean we're going to give you a loan. We're not going to take an action. But the 4 are listed here: Avangrid, Blue Float Energy, OW North America, US Main Street. 2 of them have in their portfolio oil and gas holdings. 2 of them don't. And these are big projects, big consortiums of people pulling it all together. So it's not a simple one company, few exceptions, that are doing it. None of the ones here. All right, now the why. Well, you're well aware that we're pushing for a shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And you can have it with solar, onshore, industrial scale, individual scale, something in between. Onshore wind, we've got that. Offshore wind, not yet on the Pacific coast. Certainly it's going on the East Coast and definitely on around Europe and in Asia. You could have more hydro. Citing more hydro right now could be challenging. And maybe geothermal and nuclear fission or fusion. All these are potential options to get that renewable energy. And people are saying, do we need offshore wind? That's a good question. That's where you have to decide for yourself. Now, why is it that this makes sense here? You might have seen this before. This is the National Renewable Energy Lab, and they showed this here, that dark area, is where some of the best, strongest, most predictable, most consistent winds in the world are located. I wrote a paper for BOEM that looked at what are the benefits, how do you capture the benefits of an offshore wind project in their environmental review process. In the process, I realized that there's one area in the rest of the world, it's in China, that has wind energy that's that big and that strong. There's some in the main Gulf of Maine that's some, or else way offshore. So basically, when you have some of the best resources of any particular product, you would want to at least really look closely at whether you should use them. So, and now there's a closer look, and you can see that it's where I live, right about there. And I guarantee that I will see these turbines, whether Oregon does it, or even if California does it, because here's Humboldt out here, and their stuff is not really as good as farther north. That's Del Norte County, and the way Brookings is kind of organized, I will look out at them. So I've got double reasons, aside from the fact I'm a marine biologist. I really know about it, really care about the resources that are out there. Okay, what I'd really like to do now is to focus on a reliable, what I think is a particularly good, reliable source of information, which is a report that was submitted to the Oregon legislature. It was required by being done by the Oregon Department of Energy. It was required by Senate or House Bill 3375, which said go out and take a look at what are the positives, what are the negatives, what are the benefits, what are the drawbacks, what are the issues that would happen if you deployed 3 gigawatts of offshore wind there. And I really like it because it goes through a lot of things and gives what I think is a balanced presentation. It was all based on literature reviews and talking with people. So there's a lot of questions that are still there. Potential benefits. I'm going to go through many of these. I don't have time to go through all of them in detail, but it's an immense scale of offshore wind. We mentioned briefly about that. Generation diversity values, mentioned on that. Offset land use impacts from stuff onshore. There's power system reliability, local energy resilience, economic development. There are a lot of very good potential reasons for offshore wind. On the other hand, there are a lot of potential challenges. They include concerns of effects on coastal communities, existing industries like fishing, the environment like whales and birds and fishes, cultural resources, tribal issues. Then the concerns are siting and permitting conflicts, and it's complex and all these different moving parts. It's going to be a really big challenge. Technical readiness. There are some good examples of floating offshore wind, but not nearly as many examples as bottom mounted, as happens on the East Coast and around Europe and such. Port infrastructure. As I mentioned, there are 2 ports that seem to be in the running for this, Humboldt and Port Long Beach. And that's because it takes a huge area. It takes deep water port. There are a lot of restrictions on that. So what other things? Because it's not just building them, it's making the parts. It can be parts to where they're going to build them. But then there's also a need for people to go out and monitor them, do operations and maintenance, making sure that everything is working right. So there's going to be a lot of port infrastructure, various things. And then the transmission grid, there will be, if it really gets going, there are going to have to be changes to the transmission system. And then power offtake agreements, basically who's going to buy it? Who's going to buy it at what price? And so that's a big consideration. All right, one issue, or what they said, was the need for further study, engagement, and collaboration. And that big one is what I focus on, is collaboration, the discussions and sharing information. Okay, talk about the immense scale. They said that it was 62 gigawatts is what could be placed off our coast. So 3 gigawatts isn't a whole lot of that. And in fact, this was a while ago, and they were saying a limit of 1,000 meters. Well, right now, the farther end of the wind energy areas are in about 1,800 meters. And so they are way deeper. So it's actually much more than this. That's just theoretical, because there are a lot of limits to that. All right, there's a huge need for energy. If we're going to be having the renewables, you can see that over time, there's not a lot more that's going to be coming in from onshore wind, not a lot more. Some come up with solar, but to make up that difference, it's going to need to be offshore wind or something else. And so the question is, if you don't want offshore wind and you do want this to happen, you better come up with something else.
Why were we closing? 30 minutes.
Better be quiet. So the idea is that there is a strong need for offshore wind or something else. So it's not just I'm against things. We have to be for something. The suggestion is 35 gigawatts is what we need between now and 2050. And where it's going to come from is a good question. They're saying right now, this projection was we need 20 gigawatts of floating offshore wind. It's certainly got the potential there, but are we going to want it to happen? And if not, then we either miss deadlines or we miss commitments or we have other things. Leave it at that. So Pacific Northwest requiring 80 gigawatts. So this whole, it's not just Oregon, just not Oregon and Northern California. It's also Washington and elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest. And then right now, with climate change and changing in rainfall patterns, it says what's going to be happening for available energy from hydro is going to be changing very possibly. So right now, we know the grid needs 24/7, 365. All these lights were on when we flicked the switch. If we had a blackout or brownout or a phased rolling blackouts, we're not going to like that. So what we have right now, it's supplied currently by gas and hydro, which is dispatchable. In other words, when you turn on the lights, it's there. And some onshore wind and solar, but we know that's intermittent. It's available when the sun's shining. It's available when the wind is blowing. And so that means we're going to have to do a lot of overbuild of that. So in the future, wind, onshore, offshore, solar, storage, hydro, gas, is that going to still be part of the mix? How are we going to deal with that as reducing our greenhouse gas emissions? One of the things that's interesting here is that the difference between onshore wind and offshore wind, there are a couple of big ones. One, I mentioned the onshore winds have 2 to 3 megawatt turbines. Offshore wind, they're 15 megawatt turbines. One reason for that, onshore, you have to truck things to the towers to build them. Offshore, you have to build them in the ports, in which case you can build them as big as you want, as long as your ports accommodate that. And out there, the wind is incredibly strong, it's consistent, and so you can afford to have bigger turbines out there. Now, there's an interesting thing, it talks about how much time is the rated capacity of your particular power generator going to be met? Because of the winds blowing sometimes and not others. For onshore, about 16 to 20% of the rated power is what you're actually going to get over a month. So you're going to, if you say, well, if I have 10 megawatts, you're going to get 1.6 to 0.2, it should be, 1.6 to 2 megawatt hours of it. Now, a nice thing about offshore wind, it's more like 40 to 50, and the expectation is the technology is improving, that we're going to get to the point where it will be more like 50 to 60 or higher. It is being measured and being produced right now. So the progress is there. We said it's stronger and more consistent offshore than onshore. There are not hills in the way, no buildings, no things like that. So it is better for that. Now also, higher capacity factor than solar. Not surprisingly, it's sunny during the middle of the day and only the middle of the day. So it's not going to be producing energy when it's not sunny. Now the other thing is offshore wind complements solar and onshore wind generation patterns. When it's sunny in the middle of the day, it's going to be windy offshore, but when it's not sunny, it's still going to be windy offshore. And it matches well the customer demands. Because as you come home in the fall and the winter, and you want to turn on the lights and turn on the heat, and there's no solar there, you got to rely on batteries or something else. Offshore wind will still be blowing, typically. So it matches surprisingly well. Now we're talking about land use impacts for renewables. Here's a study that is looked specifically onshore, ORESA, Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Assessment. The interesting thing about that is they acknowledge that it's not just a free open place you can put wind turbines or solar panels up wherever you want. There are going to be specific areas that are good for that, and there are going to be conflicts. So we're going to need, for renewables, this mix of renewables. We're going to have overbuild because you're going to have the times to make up for when the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining. And you're going to have storage to make up the difference. It's going to be very land intensive. And there may be local opposition. Now here's an interesting study. This was updated last month. And it's by the Columbia Law School. And they do an analysis of every state twice a year and say, where is opposition? And for Oregon, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 counties have restrictions. Those are where proposed projects are being opposed. One county here has restrictions based on the whole county. And so it's not a matter of, oh, it's okay, we're going to oppose offshore wind and put them all onshore. There are people living onshore that think otherwise. Now, it conflicts with it may coexist with other land, actually. Military, ag and ranching, forest lands, natural resources, wildlife habitat. Now, it might coexist with ranching if you have a turbine up there and cows grazing around. Tough on forest lands, tough on natural resources. So the offshore wind means we can have a lot of generation and we're not going to have to worry about losing the conflicts with the onshore stuff. So onshore wind generation is primarily in the Columbia Gorge. It's compatible with some farming, but it conflicts with visual and other resources. If you think it's going to look really ugly out 18 or 32 miles offshore, it looks really ugly when it's on the other side of your block. So there is a much different visual impact there. Solar, it's got the best technical potential in central and southern Oregon, southeastern Oregon. But that's also got the highest concentration of special use airspace, military flight corridors, sage-grouse habitat, and other sensitive areas. Immediate conflicts. If you like those things, you're probably going to be opposing these things. So coastal communities at the end of the electrical grid. I am a mile from California. I am 1 mile before the end of the extension cord that comes from the Bonneville dams. If anything happens between there and my house, we could be out of power for a long time because there's no electrical generation on the coast. There's few low capacity transmission lines to get it out to us. So it's not really fun. Disruption for extended periods is always something we need to think about. You can't reroute it, unfortunately. Now, diversity supplies grid reliability. By having more options, you can supplement things, you can move things around. If you're stuck like we are right now, it's a little bit scary at times. Now, it also means if we're producing it close, 18 miles from my house, it's not going to be a lot of line loss as opposed to the 300 miles, 400 miles, however it is from Bonneville. And it means that the transmission power that's coming, the transmission of power coming to the coast, if it's being generated from the coast, that energy can go east. It can go elsewhere. It can mean that we now have a better balance of things. So there's a lot of benefits to that. And it enhances the overall grid system. And if you've been paying attention to the discussions about the grids, we're going to need a very robust, updated grid system. Now, economic development, it's been a challenge for decades out on the coast. The economic benefits have suggested that somewhere of $7 to $10 billion of infrastructure until they are all put in. Longer term, $240 to $350 million into the economy. That's a lot. And the policies need to be put in place for equitable and sustainable economic growth. They're really worried about boom and bust. Too many examples of that. So how do we manage this? Why do we have an input to it? So we can manage this, look forward to what the issues are going to be. There are project labor agreements, community benefit agreements, where we say, all right, if you're going to do this, you're going to have all these things, we're going to see these things out, we want something. What do we get out of it? It just makes sense. So right now, because it's going to be a decade before they're out there, be at the table now. Be aware of things. Make sure that your ideas are there. The Oregon Sea Grant, just earlier last month, they had a community benefit agreement introduction. So they're starting to look at this, try to get an idea. And so it affects all Oregonians. And so everybody should be paying attention to it. The new energy sources could also support high-level industries. If you have data centers, if you have other sorts of AI, data-intensive resources, and you have a lot coming in, then you could do something like adverse effects. Now, we don't have the whole next 3 hours to go on this, so I'm not going to go into detail, but you probably have heard of many of these things. The effect on land values. In fact, on the East Coast, they found that there were more tourists that came to visit where these things were. In that case, they were 3 miles offshore. Then they were put off by coming. So it actually had an increase in it. It's curious. It's interesting. The community is an issue. We have a lot of concern about housing. All of Oregon has a problem with that. Existing industry, fisheries, they will be affected. But we need to know in what ways and how is it going to be affected? How do we make sure that there's not significant impact and there are losers and some winners? We have to see how do we avoid that. Tourism, actually, again, the data say there's an impact, a benefit. Birds, whales, fish, heritage sites, a lot of this has to do with good siting. And I don't have time. It's get at least 45 minutes to go through what BOEM did to avoid or deal with or at least acknowledge these issues. And I'm happy to do that at another venue. Can do that by the time we're going to get kicked out of library. To get an idea, just because people say, well, they're going to look ugly. Oregon Department of, BOEM did a very detailed study, and they did follow very precise prescriptive requirements to say this is what it would look like. Here is a view. It's kind of tough. You can go online and see what this looks like. This is when it's predicted visibility. This is what I see on a regular day. I think there's some in there. Actually, there are. On a particularly good day, maximum visibility. That's what you can see. You're too far away to really do it. I'd recommend go on the website because you can see it very well. They are there. If you look and see the little things like that, maximum visibility. But when you have what they call a Chamber of Commerce day, beautiful, crystal clear, everything's right, you're going to see them. Can't argue with that. This is another time. And on perfect visibility, that's what you can see. Again, this is not a good representation because it's the fuzz of the pictures. Go online and you can see what's there. This is at night. Again, this is even a worse example. Cumulative impacts. That's a particular issue for me because it's, well, if you put one of these down at Humboldt and one up in Brookings and maybe one of the farms up in Coos Bay, well, what happens when you then put one in Del Norte and a bunch down by the Humboldt or by the Mendocino? And whales have to go by each one of those. It can affect cumulatively. Depends on the particular issue, but various things need to be considered. If you add more and more sound, add more and more things in a way. Had been pushing for a long time to have an assessment early on to say what could be the cumulative impacts. And that's the sort of thing that is normally included in an environmental impact statement at the COP, the Construction Operation Plan. Way, way, way too far down the line. It's something right now, we could make up a reasonable scenario. We have an idea of how many they would be, where they might be. We don't know the kind, but that's enough to say, what information do we need to be able to answer this question? Because we have a decade. We have at least a few years before BOEM has to make a decision on their COP. And I was the environmental manager for Ocean, Oregon Coast Energy Alliance Network. It was a nonprofit that was associated with SOCAN. And I was pushing for this preliminary cumulative effects assessment. It didn't go anywhere. So, potential challenges, Son talked about the existing infrastructure or existing industries, environment, cultural resources. Again, that's an entire separate discussion, but that's something you hear a lot about. Citing and permitting, that's where right now, as they're being cited and being permitted, it's very, very necessary to be aware of what's going on, because this is where you then have the most chance to make the most input to it. Now here's something that is just starting now. It's the Ocean Floating Wind, Offshore Wind Energy Roadmap. There was a recent House Bill 4080 that said, I've got to shut up.
No, we have a key, you don't have to shut up.
Okay,
Stay
good,
as long as we want.
good. I'll tell you the story of why I paranoid at this. Anyway, this roadmap was mandated by the legislature. And it's interesting because a group of 27 Oregonians of a variety of disciplines, everything from fisheries to labor to tourism, just a whole bunch of people that were engaging in a very civic, very collaborative conversation to figure out what should this roadmap look like. And it was neat because they said, we're going to say, these are the considerations that whoever writes this roadmap should have. So if you think that, it should be looking at visual, it should be looking at economic, it should be, so they said, do that. The other cool thing about this is that with exit ramps. What does that mean? You're driving along on the freeway. You gotta go to the bathroom. You need to get gas. You have a kid that's trying for something to eat. What do? You find an exit ramp. You go off and say, it's not a matter of wondering what to do. You have a spot where you are already planned to stop and take care of business if you need to. And so the exit ramps are specific points in the planning that says, let's look at this again. Let's see if we have issues that really do rise to the level of something that we should say, no, this is not right. And so again, this is where being engaged at all levels is a good idea. And I was really impressed by the fact that this group came together and made these recommendations. So we have siting and permitting is going to be a real challenge. Technology readiness and costs. People are right that the fixed bottom offshore wind is it's getting very well developed. There are floating offshore wind projects though, and there are 2 in the UK, 1 in Scotland, another one off Scotland, Portugal, Norway, Japan, and there are a bunch that are being planned by China. They're big on this as well. There's a whole bunch that you can take and see these things. I don't want to go into the details on that. I didn't take a whole lot, but this is a balance to the table of these. And you can see that some are really close, 15 miles, 9, 87 miles. This one's kind of interesting because it is, that one there, is powering offshore oil platforms. Yeah, I guess you'd call that irony. Now, to get a sense of what's going on in the rest of the world, here, 2022, 2023, the estimate, this is in megawatts. So 66 megawatts, 103 megawatts, estimate for this about 60 megawatts. So it's not a whole lot. And it's kind of interesting because the suggestion is that this 2009 to 2020 was the demo and trial phases. So that was 4 years ago. They got through the demo and the trial. Now they're saying, all right, we're going to say pre-construction phase, where they're getting the ports that can build these things together. They're getting the systems down to anchoring and to do all that sort of stuff. And that ends in next year, 2025. So you'll see that long about 2025, we go from 60 to 300 to 800 to 1200, and it's going to take off. And long about 2027, the expectation it's going to really ramp up. And so this is installation each year. So it's collectively, you have those will be added, these will be added to these, those to those. So cumulative, you get a lot out there. So by the time we are actually talking about something, if you're saying, well, we have to see what else is going to do. We don't want to be the first ones out there. I guarantee we will not be the first ones out there. And that's where paying attention to what's going on elsewhere is really important. In addition, the Biden administration put together this Earthshots system, and this one is floating offshore wind. And they recognize two things. One is it's a new technology. The other is that new technology could be exported to the rest of the world to exploit offshore wind. We can be a leader in that. And it's a lot of the oil companies that were leaders in working offshore, working in deep water. And the nice thing is, if you have a wind spill, it doesn't mean anything. If you have an oil spill, we already know what that is. And so there are other things related to that. But one of the nicest things about this, and it's very hard to see, but the expectation from this windshot effort, it's going to reduce costs by 70%. And the costs for these are higher than onshore, but the potential for reducing those costs, once you get things to be routine, you make a bunch of them, you have them cookie cut. If you're going to make 200 off here and an equal number, like 1,000 off California, you better make sure you're not doing handmade each one. It's going to have to, and that'll cut down on the costs. Talk about the technology readiness, port infrastructure. I mentioned a little bit about that. Transmission infrastructure, that's something that we know has to be upgraded in order to deal with the intermittent renewables and to share things, get us to the 2030s as opposed to the 1950s. So that's going to be important. And then the power offtake commitment, I mentioned it has to be affordable. And one of the nice things about that document is they said, here are what we say are the best practices. So Odo had said, we recommend that there'll be community engagement. Good. Cooperative data sharing. People that get information, share it with one another so we can make the best decisions possible. Comprehensive state planning and permitting roadmap. That was from the report from 2022. Just showed you the roadmap that is going to be out by 2025. So they are implementing that. Single state agency on siting and permitting. It looks like the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD. I always thought Division Land Conservation and Development seemed a little conflicting, but so funding for data collection analysis to fill information gaps. That's why I kept saying, do a cumulative effects analysis right now. I don't have money. It's like, yeah, I'm not going to pay for it. But we should be doing that, getting the right things to know what what we should be doing. They said adaptive management to fill data gaps. I guarantee, we will have to make decisions with imperfect, incomplete data. Absolutely. You do that all the time, in fact. What you need to be recognizing is that we need to be talking with others, try to understand what other people are, how they're being affected, what their positions are. Because if you have that, then maybe you can say, well, my issue is not as big as theirs. They're going to be the loser in this. So let's work together on that. And they pointed out it occurs throughout siting, where we are right now, permitting, construction, operation, and decommissioning. One of the interesting things about floating offshore wind, they're anchored out there. If something happens and we don't need them anymore, you pick up the anchors and you take them somewhere else. As opposed to the ones that are bottom mounted, you have to dismantle it and then deal with the things that are bottom mounted. And that's a whole other issue. But that's where I think that floating offshore wind really does allow you to react in a way that makes sense. And they recommended fisheries mitigation fund. In other words, if they are fishers that are not going to be able to do what they're doing, or that takes more work to do it, then if people are going to get money from these projects, they should be compensated for their loss. Again, we don't want people that are the losers when there are plenty of winners. And all of this is available from ODO, Department of Energy. And there are other resources. There's one, Real Offshore Wind is a website on the East Coast that is relatively new, and it's really cool because it's a whole bunch of short 2 to 3 minute little videos addressing at a very high level a whole bunch of different issues. 24 that they've got right now. And it's all by professors and scientists on the East Coast.
5 minutes. Please check out your materials at the time and head towards the exit. Or the library will be closer. 5.
That's not us. Another real good source of information, NREL and PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab and National Renewable Energy Lab, put together this set of documents. And it's the Offshore Wind Synthesis of Environmental Effects Research, SEER. It's a whole compendium of research on whales, on birds, on sounds, on EMF. You've probably heard about EMF that comes out of power lines. And so there's a huge amount of information that is there already and specifically focused on offshore wind. And so people say, well, we don't know about these things. Actually, there is a lot of information that is available. Not enough. And it's specifically, a lot of it is for the East Coast. So why don't we get that stuff on the West Coast so we have better information, make better decisions. And other floating offshore wind resources, Rogue Climate, you're probably familiar with them. They've done a number of different studies and comparing community conversations and such. They've done a really good job of that. I think the best that I've seen. Marine Renewable Energy from the Scottish government, they've got a huge amount of information, a lot of work they've done there. Future costs of floating offshore wind energy in Oregon, BOEM and NREL have this offshore wind fact sheet. So this is just scratching the surface of what's available. All right, back to that first question. Without asking, you don't have to raise your hand again or whatever, but did I change your mind on your supporting, or you're in the middle, or you're against it?
No.
I didn't figure I would. The main thing is to get you to be part of the project and part of the process, being engaged, asking the questions. That I have a feeling as former, always continuing educators for Alan and Kathy, the only dumb question is one that doesn't get asked. Because if you ask a question and they give you a perfectly good answer, that's good. And somebody else is probably wondering about it too. If you ask a question, you go, ooh, that's a good question. Then you get more information. So asking the questions, make sure you do participate.